Hello, everybody, and welcome to the IIF Sustainable Finance Workshop, Crisis as Catalyst, Higher Stakes for Climate and ESG Investing. I'm Sonia Gibbs, Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance at the Institute of International Finance, or IIF, and thank you all very much for joining us today. Just before we begin, a few general housekeeping notes. I want to remind you that the workshop is being recorded and it'll be posted on our website. We do encourage questions, and we're hoping to make this as interactive as possible. So go ahead and get the questions lined up whenever you feel ready to do so using the Q&A prompt at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many as we can. Sadly, if you're joining us by phone, you won't be able to submit questions. And before we begin our program today, I really would like to thank State Street for all their support for this workshop. Our thanks particularly to Patricia Hudson, who is Head of Executive Communications and Thought Leadership, and Jen Bender, who is Senior Managing Director and Director of Research for the Global Equity Beta Solutions team. And you'll be hearing from them later in this morning as they take us through different elements of the great program that we have for you today. So just a few comments to get us started. One of the reasons we wanted to organize this workshop is that there's just so much happening on the sustainable finance arena, and it's well worth taking a closer look at some of these developments. On the opportunities side, there's going to continue to be tremendous effort put into ramping up sustainable investment and channeling private sector funds towards sustainable development goals. And so even though COP26 has been postponed to November of 2021, in a sense, that only gives more time for ramping up the pressure on the private financial sector. We're going to be hearing a lot of new climate funding commitments over the next year or so, and growing attention, we believe, to natural capital, biodiversity, social issues as the COVID-19 pandemic wears on. And certainly on the risk side, regulators and supervisors are moving ahead on climate risk assessment, the prudential policy framework, and of course, ESG disclosure, which will be a big topic for us today. You will have all seen the new report out from the CFTC panel initiated by Commissioner Russ Benham and chaired by Bob Litterman, warning of risks to the financial system related to climate change. And this joins, of course, the growing body of work produced by central banks and supervisors' Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS, which released widely anticipated climate scenarios over the summer. And finally, of course, the traditional standard setters, including the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, or BCBS, IOSCO, the insurance supervisors, all have taken a cautious stance on climate risk to date, but are laying the groundwork for hardwiring climate risk into the international regulatory framework. So this brings us to the very important topic of climate and ESG disclosure, which of course is vital both for risk assessment and for investment decision making. So both of these topics we'll get into today. And with that, it's now my very great pleasure to introduce two very distinguished speakers who have done so much to champion the cause of better ESG disclosure. And we have Janine Gilliatt, who is Chief Executive Officer for the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, and Mary Shapiro, who's Vice Chair for Public Policy and Special Advisor to Michael Bloomberg at Bloomberg LP. Janine, Mary, thank you so much for joining us today. And just a reminder to the audience, feel free to submit any questions you may have on this panel's topics as we go along. So, maybe we can start with kind of a 64,000-foot view and maybe look at developments on the global regulatory and policy level on ESG disclosure. We're maybe at something of a crossroads now between voluntary and mandatory approaches and different frameworks being developed in different jurisdictions. Where are we headed, and could the US landscape look very different after the election? Janine, you want to start?
Yeah, so I often say first, Sonia, thanks for having me. And I think ESG disclosure is a really important topic because I often talk about all of the initiatives that you talked about, Sonia, as a house, and information or data as the foundation of that house. Information and data are the lifeblood of the markets. And so you can't many of the initiatives you talked about can't be successful unless we have high quality information flowing through the system. And we often use the analogy of financial accounting standards. It's financial accounting standards that provide that solid foundation that enables the entire financial ecosystem to function. How do we get to a same point for ESG disclosure? And, you know, a lot of people have been talking about this for a lot of years. I think what fundamentally changed this year in 2020 is the issue of ESG disclosure is now catapulted to the top of the agenda for the world's largest companies, the world's largest investors, and for regulators in key markets, particularly the EU. So in January this year, within a few weeks, we had three things happen. State Street and BlackRock issued their annual letters to CEOs and boards asking companies to improve the quality of their ESG disclosure, referencing SASB and TCFD. The World Economic Forum's International Business Council, which are the CEOs of the world's largest companies, issued a report calling for an improved system for sustainability disclosure standards. And the EU announced its intent to revise its non-financial reporting directive. So when you think of all of those things happening in 1 month, January of this year, I think it really did catapult this question of ESG disclosure onto the global stage from a policy perspective.
No, I think that that's absolutely right, and it's a really nice summary of the landscape there. And Mary, how do you see it from your perspective?
Let me thank you also for including TCFD and me here today, and thanks to State Street as well for their leadership in this area. So I agree with everything Janine said. I think the demand for growth and climate-related financial disclosure, ESG more broadly, but climate-related in particular, is really being driven by investors, policymakers, and supervisors, and increasingly regulators. And Janine mentioned the stewardship letters of BlackRock and State Street, and we can add CPPIB, the large Canadian pension fund, to that. We see increasing numbers of shareholder proposals pushing for better and better disclosure. We have groups like Climate Action 100 Plus that are pushing TCFD disclosure by the world's largest emitters. And we have at the TCFD, in terms of support, more than $140 trillion in assets that are represented by TCFD supporters. So there's a huge push from investors, and it's unrelenting for better disclosure in this space. But also, I think what's evolved in the last year or two is really a much broader role and a much more forceful role for policymakers and supervisors. You mentioned, Sonia, NGFS, the umbrella organization of central banks that are involved in this area. But we also have seen at TCFD 7 national governments support the TCFD disclosure framework, more than 100 regulators supporting. Janine mentioned the NFRD, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive in the EU. And then we've seen lots of activity country by country around the world. So in the UK, for example, the Bank of England produces its own TCFD report. But we've also seen the FCA engage in a consultation to require companies with a premium listing to take a comply or explain approach to TCFD disclosure. Just recently, the Department of Pension and Work also engaged in a consultation to require pension funds to do TCFD disclosure. In Japan, they've had a TCFD summit sponsored by the government, and a second one is coming this fall, sponsored by the Prime Minister as well as the Minister of the Environment and METI. And literally around the world, dozens, if not hundreds, of official sector initiatives undertaken to improve the quality of climate-related financial disclosure.
It's a tremendous amount of firepower. So is it fair to say that, are we getting any closer to giving investors in particular what they want in terms of ESG disclosure?
I think so. Look, I think we're on a path to mandatory in many jurisdictions, and even where there isn't going to be a mandated regulatory regime. All this pressure from investors, from lenders, asset owners, and asset managers will get us to a point. We need to get there more quickly. I mean, that's the tragedy here, is that we're not moving fast enough. But I do think one real impetus will come from a more recent event, which is a number of countries have made commitments to be net zero by a certain date, to transition to net zero economies. In order for that to happen, every major industry within those economies also has to be on a path to net zero. And the only way to hold those companies and countries accountable to achieving the goal that they themselves have set will be through disclosure of critical information, so we can understand where those economies and industries are on the path and whether they're going to get there, or whether some kind of legislative or regulatory impetus is going to be needed. So I think the transition really escalates and emphasizes the need for disclosure.
Hmm. Was it too much to ask for a little bit of a crystal ball into a post-election U.S.? There's a lot of speculation that the landscape around ESG disclosure could change quite a bit. I mean, you saw the SEC had out some directive on human capital disclosure. There's more attention being paid in this kind of pandemic environment to non-financial disclosure. Would you see that intensifying after the election?
I think if we have a change in leadership, that this country will turn on a dime, and the government will turn on a dime, and we will see much better, more disclosure, much more high quality disclosure, financially oriented disclosure about climate risk. And I think you'll see it permeate the rulemaking and the activities of virtually every agency in the federal government. There's no doubt in my mind that if you look at the climate plans of the Democratic candidate, or the climate plans that were recently published by the Senate Democrats, and you see the work that the CFTC has done as a real leader among U.S. regulatory agencies on climate risk disclosure. I don't think there's any question but that we will be able to catch up. It's late, but I think we'll be able to catch up to regulators and policymakers who are leading in other parts of the world very effectively.
And Janine, would you see a change in the U.S. administration playing out on the international regulatory scene differently?
No, I agree with everything Mary said. And I think, to Mary's point around, you could see the US catch up very quickly, I think that's a tribute to a lot of people who are listening in today, because even while there has not been significant action on the government front in the last few years in the US, there's been tremendous momentum in the private sector, which is work that a lot of people on this call have been doing. So, we have a really solid base, I think, of thought leadership and work in this space, SASB being a really good example of that, can be mobilized very quickly.
And perhaps a renewed U.S. presence might galvanize things in the international arena as well.
Yeah, and I think it will take, I mean, we often say this, climate's a global issue, right? And it takes global cooperation to solve climate. There is no question that disclosure standards are a global issue, and investors operate in global capital markets. And we hear time and time again, to your earlier question, Sonia, about can investors get what they want? What they really need is comparable, consistent, and reliable information for global portfolios across multiple asset classes. And by comparable, we mean comparable across companies, consistent across time periods, and reliable, meaning that it's subject to strong internal controls and governance. So when you think about how do you get comparable, consistent, reliable information across global portfolios, the only way you do that is with globally accepted standards. And so to have, one of the largest markets in the world not really engaged in that global policy conversation right now is an issue. And it will be great if we could get to a point where the U.S. is meaningfully engaged in these discussions.
And if I could just add to that, capital markets are among the most powerful levers we have to deal with this crisis. And the US has the most liquid, deepest capital markets in the world. So to be dealing with this climate emergency without the participation of one of the potentially strongest, most influential players leaves us kind of fighting with one arm tied behind our backs. And I think to Janine's point, the private sector in the US has stepped up in a really important and meaningful way. And if we can leverage that, whether we have mandatory requirements or continue on the voluntary path, having the US presence at the table with our expertise and our capital market capabilities will be a huge improvement.
Well, maybe we could stay with the international arena for a minute and think about the need for alignment in ESG reporting standards. And there's a tremendous amount of work going on here. There was a project launched in Davos by the World Economic Forum on common metrics. And I think, Janine, you're involved in a new initiative to bring some of these standards together. How do you see that evolving?
Yeah, so hot off the presses, and for everyone listening, this will be released tomorrow. We've been working at SASB with our colleagues around the world, what we collectively call the frameworks and standard setters, to articulate a common vision for what the future of sustainability disclosure standards could look like. We're publishing a paper tomorrow. It's called Towards Comprehensive Corporate Reporting. And one, thanks, Sonia. I see Sonia giving me a thumbs up. So the paper is called Towards Comprehensive Corporate Reporting. And one of the things that has been a major barrier towards moving towards some sort of generally accepted system of standards for disclosure in this space is non-financial disclosure, and we don't like to call it non-financial disclosure at SASB because we believe these issues are fundamentally connected to financial performance. But so if we use the word sustainability or ESG or non-financial, I use those terms interchangeably, just so everyone knows. But one thing that is more complicated about sustainability disclosure is the range of users and use cases for the information. So if you think about traditional financial disclosure, it's really mostly targeted at capital markets players, whereas sustainability disclosure is targeted at multiple stakeholders. And that has made this conversation very confusing because so many people from different perspectives and different backgrounds come to it and end up talking past each other. So we're issuing a paper tomorrow that is really trying to establish even just a common terminology and set of visuals and structure for talking about how to move towards comprehensive corporate reporting standards that can be accepted globally. So definitely we'll be sharing that out broadly tomorrow. Please look for that. But we're really trying to achieve something for sustainability disclosure similar to what was achieved with the creation of IFRS for financial accounting, where we really did harmonize global financial accounting standards to a great degree. And even though the US stayed outside of that system, there was still significant work to bring the US GAAP and IFRS closer together, and there's still close collaboration there. So that's the aim, and can't wait to share all of that with all of you tomorrow.
You heard it here first, and we will have it up on our link up on our website as well to that, Janine. So thank you for sharing. Mary, any thoughts on your side about the efforts to align some of these ESG disclosure standards?
Sure. I think even in a world where we don't have where we don't have mandatory, where we do have mandatory disclosure, alignment still is a very important concept. If you think about when the TCFD was created by the Financial Stability Board, it was done to try to bring some rationalization to a world where there were some 400 frameworks for disclosure of climate-related risk. And so TCFD was created, and we landed on a framework that has been pretty universally accepted. Not of course everybody, but 1,450 global companies, assets represented of $140 trillion, market capitalization of $12 trillion of supporters, national governments, regulators, so forth, and all of that. But now that we've reached that point, as we develop standards and fill out that framework, we are again at risk of maybe having fragmentation as different jurisdictions or different standard setters go in a different direction. And I think it's really important that we avoid that situation where there are multiple different standards that makes the disclosure less comparable and therefore less valuable and investor friendly for financial decision making. And as I can say that as a nearly lifelong regulator, that it's sometimes tempting to to go out on your own, to strike out. It's faster, it's efficient to just go ahead and write your own rules. But in a world where we're going to increasingly have mandatory disclosure, it's nearly always better, especially when writing on a clean slate, as we are here, to work together with other regulators to come up with a solution to the issue that's collaborative, coherent, and global. So whether we end up in a voluntary world forever, or we end up in a mandatory world, or we end up in a combination of the two, it's going to be really important to try to create a set of standards that works across the board and around the world.
One thing I do want to really commend TCFD, the TCFD work, is for the elegance and simplicity of the framework. So if you think about the TCFD framework, they talk about 4 buckets: governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And that is very intuitive way for both companies and investors to think. And at SASB, we really do think that that concept of those 4 buckets can be applied more broadly than climate to all financially material sustainability issues, which then would give us sort of a common organizing framework to think about these issues globally at the macro level. And then SASB standards, which are very metric based, then fill in those 4 buckets from the bottom up. So think of those TCFD concepts and the SASB standards as very complementary.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think what you both say is going to be very gratefully received in the private financial sector, because the risk of fragmentation in ESG disclosure frameworks is one that's very telling for financial sector firms. We really need a globally aligned framework, as you've both pointed out. But Janine, you mentioned the M word, and we were going to talk a bit about materiality, of course. Looking at these different frameworks, some are focused more on financial materiality, others on stakeholder materiality. There's talk of double materiality. Where does SASB stand? And Mary, you could also maybe say a few words about the materiality in the context of the TCFD framework.
Yeah, sure. So double materiality was a concept that was introduced officially into regulation by the EU in its non-financial reporting directive. And I think it is a very helpful organizing framework to think about sustainability information. And this comes back to what I was saying earlier about sustainability information is inherently more complex than financial information because of the multitude of users and use cases. So double materiality is a very helpful way to help illustrate that concept, which is that there is some sustainability information that is about or helpful to understand the impact of sustainability issues on a company's financial performance. That is typically used by providers of capital through a lens of assessing risk and return. And that is often called financial materiality. Some people call it enterprise value creation. And then there is a lens of materiality that is how a company's actions impact society and how a company's actions impact people and planet. And that's more of an external impact view. And some people will call that environmental and social materiality. And so that double materiality lens is really helpful. And one of the things when you're talking about sustainability disclosure, you have to be clear about through which lens you're talking. And different regulatory jurisdictions around the world have different comfort levels with mandating disclosure through those spaces. Most of the securities regulators around the world have a very clear mandate around investor protection and are more likely to be comfortable mandating disclosure that's connected to financial performance. The EU has a very, very strong mandate to also regulate disclosure of external impact and societal impact. So that's why when we talk about this, we often talk about building blocks, because those concepts of materiality provide building blocks that can be used in different ways by different regulators around the world. So I'll start talking because I'd love to hear Mary's perspective on this as an ex-securities regulator, but it's a very important concept, double materiality.
Well, thanks, Janine, and I think that was exactly right. Materiality is obviously central to the U.S. Securities laws, and when we did the TCFD framework, we made materiality a threshold issue for the strategy and the targets and metrics pillar of disclosure. But interestingly, for governance and risk management, we did not put in place a materiality threshold because we thought it was important for investors, lenders, and others to understand the context in which decisions are being made and governance and risk management are conducted, and that it would not be a very big burden to have a qualitative discussion about governance and risk management of climate risk without a materiality threshold, so that investors could understand how the decision was made. And I think that that's important. But I also think the TCFD framework works very well for both the inward-looking and the outward-looking materiality that Janine just described. The impacts, we're obviously highly focused on the impacts of climate risk on the company, traditional financial materiality. But the TCFD framework actually works for both, including the impact of the company on the climate or on the environment.
Now that's tremendously helpful and very much puts materiality into perspective. We are coming toward the end of our time here, but there's one more question that I wanted to put to you both. And that is, a growing focus on beyond climate types of disclosure and reporting. I mean, there's going to be a task force on climate, on natural capital disclosure, the UN is putting together. Where do you see this going, this focus on issues beyond climate into much broader disclosure issues?
Yeah, so I'll start with that. So from day one, SASB was always formed to address sustainability disclosure broadly. So the SASB standards cover 5 sustainability dimensions, including human capital and social capital. And we think it's essential for investors to have that broad range of disclosures because investors have to analyze the full risk of a company and what are all the risks facing a company. So climate is a very, very important disclosure. It's a significant global focus for reasons we all know and understand, but it doesn't replace the need for investors to also understand how human capital issues are being managed, how other reputational risks are being managed. So I think that's why we always talk about the concept of broader ESG disclosure.
A lot of concern we might not have the necessary toolkit, data, metrics, and so on for beyond climate, let alone climate.
They'll develop. We've seen rapid development of tools in the climate space, and they'll develop in other areas. I do think that the pandemic has taught us that we have to be more open-minded about what kinds of events can have real material impact on the financial success of a company. And it's shown us that people care very much about sustainability and resilience in the face of lots of different problems, climate being one of them, pandemic being another, but there are many others, and we need to be stretching ourselves a little bit to think about those and how we might account for them and disclose the risks from them without at the same time putting so much disclosure out there that it becomes meaningless. So getting that balance right, as anybody who's ever practiced securities law knows, is really difficult. But I do think there are lessons from the pandemic about the value of resilience and sustainability for corporations and how those issues get communicated to shareholders.
Great. Well, that's actually a really good segue into our next panel, ESG investing in the time of COVID-19. So let me thank both of you very much for a fascinating discussion. Mary and Janine, thanks for being with us. And at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Patricia Hudson to take us through our next session on ESG investing in the time of COVID-19. Patricia, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sonia, for that wonderful scene-setting conversation on policy and frameworks. And I think for this next session, we really do want to take it down now to the company and investor level and focus on how these dual crises of the pandemic and the economic shutdown are going to affect the focus on ESG and climate change that you've just been discussing, and whether in fact we think this will help or harm efforts to promote ESG in corporate strategy and in investment decision making. And I thought I'd actually start with a quote from Mark Carney after Mary Shapiro's comments on the work of the TCFD, which of course Mark and Mary Shapiro and Mike Bloomberg helped to launch. This is from a piece he wrote for The Economist in April on the impact of COVID-19 on ESG and climate change. He said, "The traditional drivers of value have been shaken. New ones will gain prominence, and there's a possibility that the gulf between what markets value and what people value will close. We have been moving from a market economy to a market society. The price of everything is becoming the value of everything. And this crisis could help reverse that relationship so that the public values help shape private value. And the great test of whether this new hierarchy of values will prevail is in fact climate change." So I think that sets up our discussion well. And with that, let me introduce our panel of ESG leaders. First of all, for anyone who's been following ESG for the last few decades, Bob Eccles probably doesn't really need an introduction. Bob is widely regarded as the world's foremost expert on integrated reporting and was founding chairman of SASB, as well as one of the founders of the International Integrated Reporting Council. Bob is now a visiting professor at the Said Business School at Oxford. His list of publications and honors is far too long to specify here, but I would encourage everyone to follow Bob's column on Forbes.com, which is always a great source of insights. Our second speaker today is another fabulous ESG leader, George Serafim, who's the Charles Williams Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School. Barron's has called George, quote, one of the most influential people in ESG investing today. And indeed, George, as we know, has done groundbreaking work on the concept of materiality that we were just discussing, and continues to explore how companies can really gain a competitive advantage through ESG. Next we have Doug Sims from the Natural Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, which has been focusing on ensuring the rights of all people to clean air, clean water, and healthy communities for the last 50 years. This year is their anniversary. Doug is the director and senior advisor for NRDC's Green Finance Center, where he works on a wide range of issues related to renewable energy deployment, both in the United States and abroad. And last but certainly not least, I'm delighted that we have Henrik Jeppesen, who is Carbon Tracker's Head of Investor Outreach for North America. In that role, Henrik advises the world's largest and most influential institutional investors on portfolio decarbonization, ESG integration, and investment stewardship strategies. As the Guardian newspaper wrote a couple of years ago, quote, Carbon Tracker has completely changed the financial language of climate change. And I'm delighted we'll be hearing more about Henrik's work at Carbon Tracker. So thank you all again for being here today. And George, I'd like to start with you, if I may, because you have been writing about the influence of COVID-19 when it comes to the materiality of ESG characteristics for companies and investors. And in fact, you recently published some interesting research that actually looked at how companies performed during the worst of the equity market sell-off in March. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see this current crisis affecting ESG, and then would love to hear more about your new project around impact-weighted accounts. So please, George, if I could turn to you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And reflecting on your question, something that we have been looking at is how this crisis is actually affecting corporate strategy, culture, and the implementation of that strategy. In the world of ESG, of course, ESG is a very broad theme that has many different dimensions. But I think in the context of this crisis, what it has elevated is the importance of resilience, the importance of with which organizations are able to bounce back, primarily as it relates to their employees and their employee relations. And we have seen how important it has been, employee safety issues, employee engagement issues, actually the innovation with which you can change your workplace practices in order to still be competitive. And this is something that we have been looking at. The second dimension I think that it has elevated is the importance of the supply chain relationships and how it is important to have a resilient supply chain. And what has happened over the past few decades, I think, in most organizations is that for a worthwhile drive for efficiency, that resilience in many ways has been sacrificed. And I think that links also to climate change and what needs to happen there in terms of supply chains and how supply chains need to be made robust. And the third idea is actually the innovative capacity of an organization to repurpose products and services to meet new demands. And when you look at those three characteristics, one of the things that we found in our paper around corporate responses and resilience to COVID-19 was that those three responses, as it relates to employees, supply chain, and the repurposing of products and services towards the customers, actually were significant determinants of the market sell-off and how much the stock price of an equity declined between end of February and end of March. Quite interesting, we also found that those characteristics were most important in the sub-industries where you would expect them to be the hardest, not actually the easiest. So for example, we found that those employment practices and how organizations were responding in relation to their employees were more important in sub-industries that, for example, workers need to perform more routine tasks. And more routine and manual tasks are associated actually with a much harder work from home that I think many people are very fortunate to be able to work from home, but there are many people that cannot work from home. So how you treat your workforce, the ability to actually implement those workplace practices are extremely, extremely important. So this is something that we have been looking at, and I think it points to the idea of resilient organizations and organizations that can bounce back from adversity. And I think then on the second point that you raised, for me, this is in many ways a preview of what could happen at some point as both regulatory forces, but also physical events might manifest with even more intensity in the context of climate change. And as a result, that repricing of assets could accelerate and happen in a non-linear way. And then the question is, again, which organizations, but not only organizations, but I would say which communities, which countries have the innovative capacity to actually react to that repricing. And I think we will be seeing more and more of that. That started, for example, in the utility sector. Of course, it's happening now in the automobile manufacturing sector. It will happen in other industries such as agriculture and aviation as well. And the third piece that I wanted to mention that you touched on around the impact-weighted accounts work that we're doing, I think fundamentally what we're trying to do there is make meaning of all of those ESG metrics. We have made quite a bit of progress actually in terms of disclosure of those metrics, which was what was discussed before. And of course, there is much more progress that needs to be done. Those disclosures are still inconsistent. In many ways, they're incomparable across companies and so forth. And I think the work that, for example, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board is doing is extremely important in terms of standardizing and creating a market infrastructure for those things. So what we do in the Impact-Weighted Accounts Initiative is we're trying to make sense of those disclosures, and we're trying to put meaning on some things that are very difficult. They are much discussed, but they are very difficult to define, such as, for example, what does it mean for a company to have positive employment impact? What does it mean to provide good jobs? What are those characteristics, right? So, for example, do you look at the quality of the wages relative to living wages? Do you look at the benefits that are being provided, childcare, for example, which is something that we hear more and more in the political landscape as well, about the opportunity that is being created inside organizations for a diverse set of people of gender and race. So what does it mean? And the same thing, for example, when it comes to product impact, the type of impact that organizations create through their products. And I have to say, this has been a huge blind spot in the ESG data space. Most of the data is about operational practices. It's actually not about what are the types of impact that products create on their customers and the broader community. So this is something that we're also doing work. And I think the fundamental objective here is to create a research infrastructure through which we can actually systematically measure three categories of impacts: environmental impacts, employment impacts, and product impacts. And then we can have some systematic measurements so we can do rigorous research. And I would say one last point on that is that our theory is that we need to move from efforts and inputs towards outcomes and start measuring outcomes. Because fundamentally we have a big problem, which is, I call it the deforestation problem, where every consumer goods company now has adopted a deforestation policy, but actually the forest is disappearing. So we need to start measuring outcomes, not only efforts in terms of principles and policies and disclosures that are all worthwhile. And of course, they actually act as triggers of those outcomes, but we need to start actually understanding what are the types of outcomes that organizations create, and then actually hold the organizations accountable for those outcomes. And importantly, also the board of directors. I know that Bob is going to probably discuss about that board of directors can actually incentivize and hold management appropriately accountable for the execution of strategy, not based on just policies and disclosures, but actually on the outcomes that they are producing in the field of ESG, and may that be in terms of environmental outcomes, but may that be also in terms of social outcomes. This is something that we have been working on over the past year, and we have made great progress. And we have seen that actually more and more both investment organizations and companies now understand the importance of an outcome-based management, and we see great progress towards that.
That's great, George. Thank you so much for that. And I do want our listeners to know that both you and Bob have some really interesting articles in the latest issue of the Harvard Business Review that explain some of the work that you just described, George, as well as Bob's new focus. I also want to let our listeners know that the work that George described, looking at that correlation between companies with strong ESG characteristics and how their stocks performed during the market sell-off earlier this year. That was work he did with our State Street Associates group, and we'd be happy to make those papers available to anyone who is interested. So Bob, let me turn to you, and your focus now on the importance of companies explicitly articulating their purpose. Tell us why you think this is so important, how this is going to help promote a focus on ESG, and of course, as George mentioned, why the role of the board is so central in this effort.
Sure. So thank you, Patricia. I'd like to just start with a little shout out to Janine and to Mary and the board at SASB and Clara Barbie at the IMP and Tim Moen at GRI. I think this comprehensive framework paper that comes out tomorrow is critically important. We take accounting standards for granted. We don't have standards for ESG and impact information. So it's a boring topic maybe, but it's like plumbing the capital markets need. I'd also like to just reinforce a point that George made around product. So ESG is largely around operations. We need to think about the positive and negative externalities at a system level. That's relevant to the SDGs. And I think the work that George is doing with this impact weighted accounts initiative is important. George, I remember you saying that employment was, kind of the environmental stuff was, relatively easy. The social stuff was hard and the product stuff was almost impossible. But if anybody can do it, George, it's you. In terms of boards of directors, this is not a discussion really, George. This is my diatribe, Patricia, which you know. I think until we have a clear articulation of a company's specific purpose, stakeholder exclusive point of view from the board of directors, this is mostly greenwashing. I think the Business Roundtable's statement of purpose is mostly greenwashing. I've gone to these companies. I've said, this is great. You've agreed into a multiple stakeholder model. We like to use the term stakeholder capitalism. Why don't you publish a company-specific statement of purpose? They haven't done so. The board is the body with the highest level of accountability to the corporation. And until you really have the board take responsibility for the role of the corporation in society, that's going to be the groundwork, the framework for what's material, what are the stakeholders, what are the trade-offs. Management comes and goes. Boards are supposed to represent the intergenerational interests of the companies. I've got a piece I wrote with Tim Yeomans, who George knows, and Leo Strine. A statement of purpose, I think, is a pretty small request to ask. A couple of pages from the board of directors. So I'm, old and grumpy, Patricia, as you know. I'm doctrinaire until I see a statement of purpose from the board of directors of a company. I'm going to be pretty skeptical about whether they mean it or not. I've got data to demonstrate it. Other people have data to demonstrate it. Last point on this, Lucian Bebchuk and Roberto Talarita at Harvard Law School did this wonderful paper. I don't agree with their premise, but they went out and they did a survey to find out how many of these CEOs checked with their board of directors before they signed the Business Roundtable. All this fanfare, it's our big change in corporate governance since 1997. They contacted 173, about 48 responded, one check with their board. I'm thinking, this is unbelievable. This is, CEO imperialism. There's this enormous change in corporate governance. One of these bloody CEOs thought they had to check with their board. Then you go and they talk to them and say, well, we didn't have to check with our board. We've been doing purpose for years. I don't buy it. So no, we need the board of directors step up, 2-page statement of purpose, or don't waste my time. Sorry, I had to get that off my chest, Patricia. Thank you.
George, as usual, we appreciate your strong views, and I do think the role of the board across many of these ESG issues is going to continue to be a greater focus, and our next panel is really going to speak to the role of long-term investors in terms of engaging with boards more comprehensively. But I wanted to switch gears just a little bit and turn to you, Doug, because as you know, in terms of some of the skeptics who think that environmental sustainability, social responsibility, the governance issues that boards are responsible for, that each of those is so completely different that trying to combine them in one acronym is really misleading. Now, I think what's interesting about the work that the NRDC has been doing for those 50 years is that you've always sort of seen those linkages between environmental sustainability and social responsibility. So I'm just wondering how you think the pandemic has affected those connections or linkages, particularly with respect to social and racial inequities. And then how do you think investors should be thinking about incorporating these social and racial justice issues into their sustainability strategies?
Sure. Well, thanks, Patricia, and thanks IIF for putting together this illustrious panel, incredible co-panelists. I think I just want to say in the outset that I don't think NRDC has been working in this space for 50 years, but I think we are on a journey like corporate America on understanding how to integrate, in our context, more S and G into the E. So I think this is an anecdote. I think we thought, for example, that defending plaintiffs who have been impacted by water quality in Flint was really most of the story regarding how to work with communities of color that are suffering from environmental degradation. Turns out those communities don't think that's the case. They're concerned about healthcare, they're concerned about housing, they're concerned about a lot of other things. And for NRDC to really be more than transactional with those communities, we have to understand where they're coming from. So we're learning how to do that. And we're actually changing our tools, the way we assess our projects, to include an equity screen or an equity lens in those communities. So I think society is going through this process at a high level. You may have seen the Sierra Club recently released a piece about how their founding was really based in sort of a kind of white supremacist framework, and they've acknowledged that and they're coming forward with that. And so I think these kinds of issues are having to come through government, private sector, nonprofit world. So it's quite an interesting moment. In the case of the pandemic and ESG linkages, I think because we're on the ground in a lot of places, the U.S., China, India, so we have sort of a broad perspective. I think the first thing I will say is that I think, as maybe George was saying, the S is coming to the fore in this crisis, and I think the S has been, as has been stated, the most complex part of the ESG framework. So I think the S we're seeing now that the employee relationships, the government relationships, the supply chain relationships, and the customers are really key. So for example, thinking about safety in job sites, the meatpacking industry has been, also other industries which are deemed to be essential workers. Look at the pharmaceutical industry and the vaccines. Are the vaccines, if we can't trust the government to vet the vaccines, will the industry be able to self-regulate the vaccine production? What will the impact of that? How are these new supply chains working to create the vaccines? How are the companies going to make vaccines available to emerging markets at an affordable price? All these are really big S issues, which are coming to the fore very clear. How are banks, we saw it today, JP Morgan, I saw just before we got on the call, has said that they've actually found some bankers who've basically stolen some of the PPP funds from the clients. I mean, that's a big issue, how they deal with their customers and how that will affect JP Morgan's perspective. I've been involved in some PPP applications, and should companies like Ruth Chris, they're publicly traded companies, have sought PPP. These are all these really big social issues that are coming to the fore during this. Now, I think this reinforces the linkages with G in particular, because how those decisions were taken are going to be under the microscope for these companies during COVID. How they protected their workers, how they entered into these contracts, how they chose to access or not access governmental support. Look at the airline industry. Reported that 96% of surplus has gone to buybacks and dividends, not to save for a rainy day. How will that reflect the industry? How will the industry, some airlines are not filling the middle seat, others are. I mean, these are just these big issues which are the decisions and the social impacts with the sort of stakeholders are going to be very, very at the fore, I think, going forward. On the E piece, I'll quickly say, I think it's interesting that I think maybe, as George also said, that this is a kind of a dry run for climate change. And actually, it's maybe even being more than that, because, a pandemic, from one point of view, is a physical risk of climate change. When loss of habitat infects disease vectors, then you have this essentially what amounts to a physical risk. It's not an acute risk, it's a chronic risk which goes over time. But how we're responding to that environmental challenge and the overlap between that and the governance and the social is going to be really interesting. This will occur with greater frequency. And of course, you have the California fires. An interesting piece I saw in the New England, was it Medical Journal, talking about how the disaster response of government and companies to a fire or a storm, meaning go to a shelter, stay indoor, all these things, those are direct counter indicators what to do with COVID. So our whole, how companies deal with physical risk and these disasters will have to be really evaluated, because they're going to be a confluence of these things. And the last thing I'll just mention on this point is just that on the transition risk side of climate, similarly, we are seeing some massive asset repricing in the fossil fuel sector already. Many of the fracking companies are now functionally insolvent and being kept afloat through government loans, essentially. And the gas they have is actually out of the money for the foreseeable future. So we're seeing that happen. We're seeing massive customer behavior changes rapidly as well, which could affect asset prices and all these things. So I think the interconnection is very, very strong and very, very clear. That's been posed by COVID.
That's great, Doug. And I agree. I think a lot of what we've heard today points to how this current crisis is really acting as a catalyst to reinforce a lot of these linkages and accelerate a lot of the trends that we were seeing before the pandemic. And Henrik, I know a lot of investors embrace ESG, particularly long-term investors, because it is a very helpful framework for focusing on long-term issues, a lot of slow burn issues. But if we're talking about climate change risk, obviously with the fires in California, the other extreme weather events we've been seeing, that climate crisis seems to be with us now. So in terms of the work that you're doing at Carbon Tracker, what's your view on the most impactful steps that investors can take to accelerate this transition to a low carbon future? And how do you see the role of data and disclosure and or regulation? And we've mentioned the TCFD a number of times today. Is that enough? Is that reporting enough to influence the real dramatic changes in capital allocation required to adequately address climate change?
Thank you so much, Patricia, and to the IIF for setting this up, and appreciate the opportunity to talk here. Carbon Tracker, for those who don't know, is we are a financial think tank, non-profit based in London, focusing on identifying, quantifying stranded asset risk, primarily in the fossil fuel sector, and investigating and looking at the impact of energy transition to a low carbon economy for both companies, investors, and the capital markets more broadly. So we tend to focus more on how are these things also implemented in practice, and what are people doing, and so on. So you can say, first of all, I think it's important that investors should start to use the data that's there. They should not sit around and wait for the perfect framework, the perfect disclosure, the perfect regulation. Actually, it's one of the worst things if they sit and wait around until regulation has been implemented, because then the market has probably already reacted to it. So it's about using what is already out there and start to understanding it. TCFD is a good framework. It's a good starting point. But if it stays in, you can say, glossy brochures and reports, and it's not actually integrated into companies' strategies and activities and how they respond, it's not really worth too much to focus on these disclosure. And it's a little bit to both to George and Bob's commentaries, like if these things need to be implemented into what the companies are actually doing. Scenario analysis is one of the areas that we focus a lot on at Carbon Tracker, and it's one of the recommendations. And we think that's essentially very important also for when we look at fossil fuel companies, also companies reliant on this, but also in general for companies. And you can say it couldn't probably have prevented a lot of the things that happened over the last 6-9 months, but I don't think a lot of companies have envisioned a situation where 80% of revenue would disappear over a matter of weeks, or maybe over a matter of 1 week. But could you have discovered that in a scenario analysis? Could have prevented that? Probably not, but you would probably have developed some better development plans. And I think that's probably the starting point here. Then to the other one is climate change. To bring it more into one of the E issue, if you can call it that way. It's not really only E. It's also broad based, and it's implementing and impacting both oil, gas, and coal companies, of course, but also a lot of the surrounding industries and all investors are impacted, especially if they have the so-called universal owner perspective, where they own a little bit of everything. Climate science is settled. It is happening. It's getting worse, and unless we change direction or pathway, it's going to get even worse. And you were mentioning wildfires in California. We had them in Australia. We have them everywhere. We have drought. We have all of these things. So investing is really much about looking forward and trying to adopt and adapt and be ready for what is coming, so you can benefit from it to make money. That's essentially it. Let's not kid ourselves. So the more we continue down the business as usual, what's happening now, the more physical damage, the more problems we're going to have down the road, and therefore we have to focus more on physical risk and how you adapt to the new world with more storms, floodings, etc. So that's one area. The more we think, or we hope, or we plan for energy transition to happen, meaning the only way we can really stop a lot of this climate change is by cutting down in absolute number of emissions emitted, period. There's not really a lot of other ways we can come around that. So that means that we need to change the energy system. 80% of of energy today is delivered from fossil fuel. That has to change, and we need to find some other energy sources. So that means that there's a big opportunities and risk in transition risk and mitigation. How do we get from where we are today to the new way? So these are kind of like, if you can say that, you have kind of like these two directions that people are going. And just to put a quick numbers on it, we put out a report recently called Decline and Fall, in which we estimate that the fossil fuel industry directly or indirectly basically impacts more than 25% of equity markets, global equity listed market, $18 trillion plus minus given the market development, half of non-financial bonds outstanding, 8+ trillion, and probably 4 times as much in unlisted debt. So this is massive impact and massive things that investors have to look at. Then for investors, they should also keep in mind that the size of the market matters probably less than the arrival of tipping points. When of the market moving from a growth to an ex-growth market, that's really where market valuation are changing, and that's what we have seen. That would make reference by Doug on what we've seen on fossil fuels. Carbon Tracker was made famous back in 2010-11 when we published our first report about a carbon bubble and said that there was a lot of stranded assets in the fossil fuel industry. Now we have seen over the summer, we have seen several oil and gas companies coming out and revisiting their impairment test criteria and written down close to, what is that, $50 to $100 billion worth of assets of where they have already made significant investments into. So these things are coming out here. So the investment industry is focusing on when the market goes from growth to ex-growth, and that's where we have the pricing. And then my last point would be investors also need to maybe step up and be responsible investors. We have the principal agent split between the owners and the operators, and there's been a lot of focus on that. And maybe it's time that really comes more into more into focus. Companies, both the board of directors, but especially CEOs and CFOs, etc., they work for the investors, and that I think relationship needs to be more clear to enforce that things are happening. If companies management are not doing what investors want them to do, then they need to find somebody else to run these companies. So
yeah, no, I think that's a great point, Henrik, and obviously for investment companies like State Street that has a large index-based business, our engagement with companies on these sustainability issues has obviously become much more important over the last few years, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned. We heard Mary Shapiro in the previous session talk about the necessity to get companies on this path toward net zero. One of the interesting debates that I think particularly for asset owners is still front and center is around the most effective way to transition to a low carbon world. Last year at State Street, we had an ESG session where I talked about the battle of the bills. It was around the time when Bill McKibben, a well-known climate activist, had argued again very forcefully for the need to divest from for investors to divest from fossil fuel companies. That was quickly followed by a commentary from Bill Gates, who argued that divestment had zero impact on climate outcomes, and that instead investors should really be focusing on investing in climate mitigation or climate adaptation technologies and innovations. I'd like to open it up to the whole panel, but Henrik in particular, just given the work you do you have a view on those two points of view? Is it either or, should it be both and? What's your view?
Yeah, so I'll just I'll maybe start by saying, well, we are not an advocate for either divestment or that you should do it or not do it. We are very supportive of anybody who want to use our research is using it. The 350.org campaign by Bill McKibben was largely founded on some of the research I mentioned earlier coming out of Carbon Tracker. We are very involved in shareholder engagement activities like Climate Action 100+, etc. So we are not necessarily taking a hard view on either or in this area, but probably want to emphasize maybe two things. I think it's probably, if you look at a portfolio level, where if you're an active or passive manager or product, if you have it's very difficult to make a big impact overall with this area. But if you have a passive mandate and you have to follow an index, the only way you can get out of that fossil fuel investment, if you want to get out of that, is typically when it has fallen so much in value that it's no longer qualifying. That means you take the whole way down. So it's probably, if you're a passive investor, you would probably focus more on being an active owner. We have heard a lot of passive managers saying they're passive investors but active owners. So that's the area, and a lot of stuff we just talked about. If you're an active manager, obviously you have more availability to call and say, okay, you can fund some other companies in this area. But just as a reference, which is some work that we come up with here in not so long, but you can go and check out the data yourself. But if you look at all the capital being sold to the market by equity, in equity, either existing shares or new shares in IPOs and secondaries, globally since 2012, less than 10% of that has been into alternative energy sources when we look into just on the energy type investments. So there's still a lot of work that need to be done in this area there. So for portfolio level, it might make sense for your own risk and assessment, but it doesn't really change anything if you just sell an existing issued share to another investor. And that's where you can say the difference between the top down and the bottom up.
Right, exactly. That in some ways, if you're selling a dirty producer of energy, you're running the risk of selling it to someone who doesn't really care about that. So I do think there are questions around that. But I'd be interested in hearing from all of you, actually. I mean, what do you think the most important catalyst is at this point in terms of channeling private sector investments into renewables and climate resilient infrastructure, or any of these other solutions that are going to be necessary to address the climate challenge?
Patricia, if I may just quickly reflect on that. The first thing is around the previous discussion that you had with Henrik, just to reflect on that and then provide my view on how to accelerate those investments. So if you think about how capital markets actually work, So let's say that you start divesting and you have enough divestment to actually impact cost of capital for a company, which is an open question. Actually, the data around that is very mixed. And I would say probably it's just that this effect doesn't exist, actually. That is, there is enough arbitrage out there that other people will come in, and as a result, there isn't a strong effect on cost of capital. But let me play the scenario, and let's say that you have actually been able to affect the company's cost of capital because of divestment, and that might, then you need to make another logical link then that this somehow will affect their new investments and their new production capacity and so forth, which is, again, it's a question mark, we don't know. But let's say that this happens. And at the same time, regulation doesn't catch up to that. So you have actually impaired the market price that you observe in public markets, but at the same time, you haven't actually affected the cash flow capacity of the company because, for example, regulations might not be happening, business is as usual. What happens then, and this is actually what we wrote several years ago, probably 6 or 7 years ago in an article with Mark Fulton, but I know he's involved in Carbon Tracker as well. What happens is that actually the price to cash flow ratio from a private equity perspective becomes very, very attractive. And there are enough private equity players actually that will buy those companies. And then what happens is that, one, you lost all the disclosure and the transparency that comes with public markets, because, for example, in the US, there are no disclosure requirements as it comes to many of the issues that we're discussing for private companies. And the second one is also you lose your ability to engage with those companies because they're private. You don't hold any shares, you don't hold anything. So you can imagine that in that scenario, it's not even clear that actually you got the outcome that you wanted to get in the first place. So I think when it comes to that, one of the most meaningful, I think, approaches to understanding how you can actually manage that risk from an asset owner perspective is some work that was done for the New York Common Retirement Fund with in excess of 200 billion in assets under management. There was a decarbonization advisory panel that the comptroller and the governor of New York appointed. I was one of the members of that, and we debated for a long time around this. And we had a very, very healthy debate, and where we came out, and by the way, the report is publicly and available online for free for everyone to see. But the idea there is that there's an approach of minimum requirements when it comes to that, where actually you set clear targets for companies within a clear time horizon that they need to meet in order, for example, to decarbonize their business and so forth. So let's say in the next 3 years, a target that they need to meet, and you actually are continuously invested in those companies and you engage with them to actually help them move towards those targets. And if they don't, then you can actually get out because the risk that you are facing is fundamentally unacceptable. And then just 10 seconds on your question about acceleration. I think acceleration of investments will happen because at some point governments and regulators need to do their job, which is they need to price carbon fundamentally. And we need to have carbon pricing to accelerate those investments. Even if you still see right now, what's the global price of carbon, which is basically says, even when you take economic activity where carbon pricing doesn't exist, that would be about like $2 or something on a global price level, right? That needs to be closer to $80 at least, probably. So we need to get there. And the last thing that I will say is that, of course, the role of the government is very important, but we wrote an article with my colleague, Rebecca Henderson, for the American Economic Association, where we basically said carbon pricing is a necessary condition, but is not a sufficient condition. Many government regulations, of course, are very, very important, but one of the things that we know from the field of technology and innovation is how slow organizations are because of inertia and other forces to actually adopt in a fast way many of those innovations and respond. So we actually need to also accelerate some of the work that Bob is doing, which is basically creating more of what we call authentically purpose-driven organizations in order to accelerate the technology curves and move forward with the decarbonization of our whole economy.
That's great, George. Thank you. Well, we're coming to the close of our discussion today. I want to thank all of our panelists. At this point, I'd like to turn the program back over to Sonia to introduce the concluding session of today's event. So thank you very much to all of you.
Patricia, very many thanks to you and the panelists. That was an amazing discussion. I think we had a tremendous audience and really a great flow of questions. Thank you. So we now move to our final panel today, which is really getting into the whole sort of sausage making of ESG disclosure here on ESG metrics, methodologies, and data. So this is practitioner perspectives, and it'll be chaired by Jen Bender of State Street. And please, Jen, over to you to take this forward.
Thank you so much. So I'm really excited today. The focus of the panel is going to be, what really needs to be done from a data methodology and reporting perspective to accelerate the integration of ESG and climate change risk in particular into investment management programs. Our panelists today are David King, who is the head of ESG at Fidelity, Gil Lentors, who is a director energy sustainability and infrastructure at Guidehouse, and he's also an executive director at PCAF. Leon Saunders Calvert, who's the head of sustainability finance at Lipper and INA Insights Refinitiv, and Mary Catherine Lader, who's the head of Aladdin Sustainability at BlackRock. So thank you, all of you. So I just wanted to maybe set the stage by, highlighting sort of what we all know, that it's well known that unlike credit ratings, ESG scores are poorly correlated with each other. ESG ratings firms disagree about which companies are good or bad. And it's not surprising given the need for standardized disclosures. And we do know that the providers have mostly created their own frameworks. They can use structured or unstructured data. They can source information from a variety of platforms, anywhere from company reports to internet and media content. They can be forming their models based on the business models of the companies or on the products that the companies are selling. It can be done, relative to the other companies in a sector, in their own sector or not. And so there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into that quantification. And then meanwhile, within the realm of climate, we have regulatory entities like the European Commission and disclosure initiatives like TCFD that have started to propose specific metrics around carbon emissions for companies and investors to measure and report. And these efforts, while a big step in moving forward with the goals from the Paris Climate Accords, are creating their own set of challenges for our industry. So I'm going to stop there, and we're going to do a round of self-introductions. So Gail, I'll start with you.
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. Happy to speak at this panel. My name is Giel Lentors, and I'm Executive Director of the initiative called Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, which actually picked up one of those challenges just presented by Jen. We're creating and have created the global standard for measuring financed emissions of loans and investment. That standard is published on the 5th of August and is now under public consultation. And it's a growing initiative. We have 75 financial institutions being part. It's industry-led. It's open source, and everybody is free to join this initiative and provide feedback on the standard that we have created to measure the emissions in a consistent way of loans and investments. I'm happy to tell you more about this initiative.
Thanks. Over to you, Leon.
Sure. Hi. So Leon Saunders Calvert. I work for Refinitiv, a very large market data provider. And I run a few businesses for Refinitiv, most pertinently for this conversation, our sustainable finance business. And of course, that includes, centrally, it includes our company ESG data, which we largely provide to the asset management community, the asset owner community, and indeed more and more investment banking community these days. So I guess I realize I'm one of the providers that you're referring to, of the number that are out there today that have the challenge of really trying to help mainstream the integration of ESG into investment decision making, and delighted to talk about what I see as some of the opportunities and challenges associated with that today.
Hi, I'm Mary Catherine Lader. So as you mentioned, I run Aladdin Sustainability. So BlackRock has a technology platform called Aladdin. Some of you may be familiar with. It's an operating system for asset management used by several hundred of the world's largest investors. And so consistent with BlackRock's commitment to sustainable investing broadly as an asset manager, this year we launched this new business to essentially build sustainability data and products, technology products. So we've been focused on climate risk in particular, and then partnering with a number of the providers, Leon included, to help ensure that we offer sort of more choice and can simplify ESG integration.
Thank you, Mary Catherine. And last but not least, David.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity for me to be here. I'm David King. I'm head of ESG stewardship here at Fidelity Investments. Our team is responsible for ensuring that our overall fund base of $3 trillion of AUM is managed and aware of the ESG risks and opportunities of their funds. We're also looking at how we balance and bring that awareness to a defined suite of sustainable investing or ESG funds as well, and developing our own research and points of view on companies. We've recently launched our own ESG rating, so it'll be interesting to have this conversation with everyone about third-party providers, data, and how we're using it.
Thanks. So, I mean, obviously, having the data we need really starts with whether or not that data is actually available, which really goes to the question of standards. So the first question to you, to Leon, will be, so with respect to standards, there obviously are a number of organizations trying to establish systematic frameworks, including SASB and TCFD. What's missing and what's needed?
Look, I think it's a good question. I'll try and do justice to it relatively quickly. The two examples that you gave, SASB and TCFD, and as you rightly mentioned, there are a number of others, they're doing very different things to each other. And that's partly because ESG is not really one thing. It's an amalgamation of a whole bunch of material, non-financial data points, which try to address different thematic issues. TCFD is very clearly focused on climate-related issues. SASB more broadly is focused on what is material around ESG data from a financial perspective. So really trying to accomplish two different things. If I try and break down what I think are the kind of core components of the different areas for standardization, I think you arrive at a few key points. The first is that if you think about financial data, first of all, you have GAAP reporting, you have IFRS reporting around financial data, and there isn't really yet the equivalent of that for ESG data. So how do you know that the same data point, or at least what looks like the same data point, has been calculated in exactly the same way by two different companies? So even if two different companies report that data point, do you know you're looking at the same thing? So that's the first sort of issue of standardization. I think the second issue of standardization is about what data points actually get reported. So what do companies have to report? Now, of course, ESG data only exists really thanks to the institutional asset management community, very largely at the moment today. It's not really regulation which has driven the existence of ESG data today. It's pressure by investors effectively on companies to disclose information. And that's not always understood, I think, by most of the community, but or at least many others outside it. But nevertheless, wanting to establish what good mandatory reporting looks like, which data points need to be reported, is really important. And I think we'll see more of that over the course of the next few years. But unfortunately, even that's complicated because it probably looks different as to what's really material to report in different sectors. Different sectors have different levels of materiality. So it gets quite complicated quite quickly, but important to solve. And I think thirdly is actually how the data is reported. So if you think of financial data, again, to use that analogy, we all know that when you go to an annual report, you can go to a few different parts of the annual report and you can expect to see a P&L, you can expect to see a cash flow statement, a balance sheet, and you know what's going to be in them. Broadly speaking, everyone knows what those things contain. There's no equivalent for ESG data. There's no page or report or table which is standardized where you can go and get the data that way. You have to search for it through filings, often through textual information. And so I think that's another area of standardization that's required. That's before you even get onto standardization of things like fixed income issuance and the binary certification of what a transition bond is or what a green bond is, for instance. So, a number of different levels of standards are required there when it comes to, having really robust data, all of which, we're in a maturing process. We don't need to be upset that we're not there yet, but certainly, driving towards that level of maturity, I think is really important.
So, I mean, that's a good point, and I feel like it's not surprising then that different ESG data vendors are coming up with their own techniques, right, and their own frameworks. So over to David, maybe you could comment on how useful are the different approaches. What are some of the different pros and cons?
Yeah, so I believe there is a role for third party vendors here. They served at the beginning a very important purpose of starting to structure or bring together and aggregate data that was, to Leon's point, it is all over the place. It is, some is reported. There are different standards. There are areas that aren't reported. And these data providers have really helped from an aggregation model perspective, and also helped fill in some of the data gaps through estimation or imputation techniques and things like that. They also started the conversation of what a framework and a reporting would look like, or ratings would look like. All important pieces of the conversation, and also important thought starters for us as asset managers as we began our journey throughout this process. I think all the companies that we've engaged with are on a journey on how they'll report this data and how and what they should report, and doing their own materiality assessments. I think it's very important that we're seeing standards organizations come together and create a single point of view or a voice, and asset managers, asset owners, and companies are participating in this. I think SASB has done yeoman's work with helping create kind of those standards and standard metrics, so that definition of what's being measured, how it's being measured, and then how it's reported are very important. And materiality at the industry level, which we think is important. It's not a one-size-all-fits model here, but an opportunity to then for companies to tell their story and report on the important metrics. For us as users or asset managers, it's been an evolution of how we use that data and how we use the ratings themselves. The ratings themselves from third parties are table stakes right now. I would say that every large asset manager is using or has an awareness of MSCI or any other ratings out there. They're an important benchmark that our customers, asset owners, or institutional clients, that's how they look at our portfolios when they're looking at our underlying holdings to evaluate us on our authenticity, on how we are selecting assets for their strategies. But I think it's also important for us as active managers to have our own point of view on what is material ESG factors. So, we've been able to extend that conversation even further internally to use our own expertise and marry that with our fundamental point of view to then develop our own ESG materiality map, if you will, built on some standards that have been started throughout the community. So we're not trying to start from afresh or redefine what we're measuring with companies as we're talking to them about what to report, but we're using those standards and evolving them in how we weight things, how we use them, and then how we build that forward-looking rating, which I think is an important part of that.
That's great, David. Thank you. So we're going to switch tacks a little bit. We've been talking about ESG ratings sort of writ large, but recently in the last year or two, there's been a lot of movement around reporting on climate data. And specifically, I'll turn this question over to Mary Catherine. I mean, last year, TCFD started to be very specific about what carbon metrics they recommend companies report. Do you think this will have an impact, and sort of what are the main implementation challenges, particularly with respect to the data gaps?
I think it'll have a huge impact. I think we've already hit on the importance of convergence around, if not standards, then sort of shared approaches and transparency around data disclosure. Certainly in the case of climate, it's all the more important because you're not just expecting companies to report a single data point that then allows an investor to make a decision. You need a collection of data points. You need a sort of then methodology to turn data from companies and about companies into climate risk metrics. And so I think it's not just that specificity from TCFD or from the EU, for example, as part of the sustainable finance obligations, but also, frankly, transparency around methodology. And so if we do expect if we do expect investors to be able to make decisions about climate risk, we need better tools to do that. That's what we're focused on doing and building as part of a new product called Aladdin Climate, where essentially we're taking the data that we do get from companies, but also the 21 general circulation climate models, working with other partners who have different unique data sets to then come up with both physical risk metrics to understand the physical impact of climate change, as well as transition risk metrics driven by sort of our own policy scenarios. So my point is there's a lot of different inputs. It's not as simple as just what you get from companies. And so while TCFD sort of clarity and precision will make a difference, I think that we actually need to have more dialogue around methodologies that take us from those sort of data sets to actionable metrics, and then again, the tools to make them more useful to investors overall.
That's a great segue into a question I have for Gil, which is, what's the view of PCAF then on climate data?
Yeah, good question. Good question. Yeah, maybe first start with a response that adds also to the comments of the previous speakers. What is unique about PCAF? It's that it's a collaborative approach. It's a collaborative approach of the industry. So now 75 financial institutions work together to create this standard. And we are pleased that there is this greenhouse gas protocol that already defines a lot, and that also defines for companies how to report on emissions. So in that sense, we need also an ESG protocol, you could say, for companies how to report on ESG. And that can, to my opinion, only be created through a collaborative approach, fully transparent, and also through a large stakeholder engagement. But to connect to that, to your question, is also on the data front, going back to climate. Then it's, of course, if you have that type of data out there, it should be publicly available. You should have that data in a space where everybody can use it, and that's also what I see in, for instance, Europe happening with the non-financial reporting directive, where companies are required to report on their climate data according to the greenhouse gas protocol, and that data should be available for financial institutions to steer on. The next question, and that is what PCAF has been doing, is, well, if you have that data, if you know the emissions of a company according to the greenhouse gas protocol, how do you attribute that to you as a financial institution? What is your share of those emissions? As if you have a loan or if you have an equity stake in that company, what is your share of those emissions? And PCAF has defined robust rules for that based on also EU policies. But we have also extended that to other asset classes, like a mortgage, like a real estate, like project finance, like even motor vehicle loans. So for various asset classes, we have defined methods and attribution rules, accounting rules, how to account for emissions based and linked to IFRS or GAAP. So if you report as a financial institution on your financials through the methods by PCAF, you also connect emissions data to it. And one thing, next to publicly available data, we also believe that data should be scored on the data quality. And that's also an important element in the standard, because there's a lot of data out there, but often it's sector average, for instance. So, and that comes at the lowest score. And by scoring data quality, you give financial institutions an additional instrument to develop a strategy to improve their data, because they can identify the hotspots in their portfolio where the biggest emissions are. And if that data is poor, then that leads to a strategy to improve that data for those poor data hotspots, you could say. So in the PCAF standard that is out for public consultation at the moment, you will find data quality score cards for each asset class. So for mortgage, real estate, a business loan, listed equity and bonds, we have defined when climate data scores with a 5 or scores with a 1. We have defined level 1 as the highest quality score, which is audited greenhouse gas data from a company, for instance. That is important and is also a system we believe that auditors, the accountancy firms, should use to monitor and audit the data for their auditing purposes linked to their financial auditing.
That's a great segue then into, let's assume that, we can finally coalesce around the actual data. Then how do we make that step to use this to really quantify, two key risks that are really facing investors when it comes to climate risk, and they're often discussed as transition risk and physical risk. So maybe Leon, if you could take a crack at that one, that'd be great.
Look, I think there are a couple of issues there. We've talked a lot about data, but data doesn't actually answer the question of what is my exposure to transition risk under various different scenarios. It doesn't answer the question of what is my exposure to physical risk. Indeed, for transition risk information, emissions data is really important because fundamentally you want to look at the trends in emissions and are they trending in the right way? Are they trending in line with the Paris Agreement? But you might want to look at other data as well, the sort of data that the EU taxonomy is driving for, things like the capital injection into clean energy that's being deployed, and indeed the capital raising you might be tapping into capital markets for in order to reduce your emissions further. So there's a host of different data that you might want to tap into to drive that. But nevertheless, you are effectively looking for alignment to a benchmark, and the Paris Agreement is probably a very good place to start. Around physical risk, which is really the exposure to the dangers of the worst effects of climate change happening, that's a different set of data that you need very largely. That's data associated with risks of certain latitude and longitude locations, the latitude and longitude of your locations where you manufacture or deliver your services, manufacture your products, or those of your supply chain. What are the risks to flooding? What are the risks to extreme weather conditions? And then trying to quantify that and understand what the implications of that are in terms of economic implications for the organization, and as an asset manager, the economic implications for the portfolio at large. And that's a lot of data, and it's a lot of different data, which is above and beyond just emissions data, company emissions data. So there's work to be done there. I think that it's fair to say that you can work with the data that exists today. We all think it needs to be better, more robust. And that's certainly the direction that we're driving on the Refinitiv side. But there's also quite a lot of wood to chop once you've got the data to turn that into really usable, quantifiable, measurable risk exposures, and indeed opportunity exposures. The opportunity to finance the sort of mass decarbonization of the economy is not a small opportunity for the institutional finance community. In fact, it's a very large one. But trying to quantify that and identify those opportunities is not easy, and it doesn't come with just good ESG data.
And so that's actually a good segue into sort of the biggest beast of all when it comes to actually measurement. And I'm going to pose this difficult question to Mary Catherine, which is, how do you measure carbon, climate risks and opportunities across asset classes, right? Because that's where the data challenges really grow exponentially. And certainly as head of, Aladdin sustainability, I think you guys have probably spent quite a bit of time thinking about that.
I agree with what Leon just said, which I think is sort of consistent with what I was saying as well, and that it's not just about data. And so it's really about analytics. It's really about how you choose to assess based on what you do have. Oh, poor Leon's having Wi-Fi challenges we're seeing. It's really what you do with the data that you get. So for example, in the case of understanding the climate risk of a corporation, that's a matter of really fundamental analysis, in addition with a few other methods and techniques of understanding the revenue impact, the operational impact, coming up with climate adjusted values. In the case of mortgage-backed securities, it's running countless scenarios to understand the impact of precipitation, temperature rise, flooding, hurricanes on asset prices, having both historical data, but also really academic research that shows forward-looking correlation between changes in physical climate and economic indicators like home prices, for example, or insurance premiums. And so that's a massive body of work to sort of take, again, sort of the initial data sets that you may get about a carbon footprint from a corporation, for example, or for a specific physical asset, about just their physical location and the historical changes in the climate at that physical location, but to then really bridge that to academic work and really peer-reviewed research to understand how that then connects to future scenarios and how that should affect and be included in your evaluation and financial models. So it's not a matter of, how you do this across asset classes is not unlike how you do valuation differently across asset classes. And so what we see this as an opportunity to really have a different lens and sort of series of inputs in our existing risk models and our existing valuation models, and to really have a whole new series of data sets that can inform those and come up with climate adjusted financial analytics. Just as you have, so our aspiration is that when you're, for example, using our platform, if you're looking at a mortgage-backed security, if you're trying to rebalance a portfolio that's a sort of, long duration fixed income portfolio, you can see your standard bond analytics, and right next to that, you can see your sort of climate adjusted analytics. But that's a long journey, and it's rife with a number of different subjective sort of twists and turns, and that's part of why I think transparency and sort of malleability of the tools that allow investors to do this is really critical. So that's certainly from like an investor perspective. And then I think that this is an opportunity, this question, if I can add one more thing, this question really gets at an opportunity for asset managers to break beyond asset management as we think about climate risk, because it's not just what we're talking about doesn't just affect investment decisions, but really we're going to be generating very useful data, useful information, useful analytics for the corporations themselves as they think about managing their own sustainability programs, as they think about managing their stakeholders. And so I think that's a critical opportunity for all of us to make sure that we have a sort of broader reach and dialogue.
Great, thank you. So I've got two somewhat more esoteric, very research model-y type questions that I'm going to ask. Then after that, we're going to sort of round out. So for those of you who are listening, now's a good time to start thinking about any questions that you want to ask our panelists, and feel free to send them in. I'll be assigning them sort of on the fly as we go along. So first question for Gil. Now this is a question that's sort of near and dear to my own heart, because these questions seem easy, but we can spend weeks and months actually debating how to do these things. So we take carbon, for example. There's a lot of debate over the actual metrics to use. So for instance, when you measure carbon, should we be normalizing by market cap, by revenue, within sectors? Should we be using scope 1 versus scope 2 versus scope 3 emissions, or some combination of all three, or some combination of certain subgroupings of all three? So what's your take on this debate, and whether or not there is a single right answer before we kind of get more guidance from the regulators?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Indeed, a very relevant question. We have seen many metrics out there, and also that leads to less transparency and accountability for the financial sector. So we need to harmonize the metrics that are being used. And that's also the purpose of PCAF, to clarify the use of metrics, because I think there will be more metrics out there because metrics serve different purposes. For instance, PCAF has developed this standard in line with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Same like companies report on their scope 3 emissions, PCAF has defined methods for financial institutions to report on their scope 3 emissions, their finance emissions. And that's like companies do an absolute metric. So you add up all the emissions of your loans and investments to a total number. And you can also report that by asset class, of course. There's clear reporting guidance in the requirements and the recommendations in the standard. But that absolute metric, of course, is a good metric for steering on the Paris Agreement. If you want to decarbonize in line with the Paris Agreement, and you have developed strategies per asset class, you can track that with an absolute metric. It's harder to track that with an intensity metric. But if you want to compare with another fund, then of course an intensity metric works. So I think there will be always different metrics out there, But I think over time, especially the metrics, the absolute metrics and the intensity metric will result as the main metrics. What I wanted to mention is that PCAF has defined clear attribution rules on how to attribute emissions to you as a financial institution, depending on the asset class, the loan and investment. But in this attribution factors, there has been a lot of debate on how to do it. In the end, we aligned with the AU technical expert group on the Paris-aligned benchmark and the transition benchmark that have used the EVIC metric, enterprise value including cash metric, which allocates the emissions of a company based on the share on the EVIC. So if you have a loan compared to the EVIC, that is your share of finance emissions. So if you have 10% of the EVIC, which is, then you have 10% of the emissions. That's the emissions you take on board. That's the scope 1 and 2 of the company. The scope 3 is always separately reported. So if you take in the scope 3 emissions of a company, you should report that separately. That's also in line with the greenhouse gas protocol. So there's clear reporting guidelines in the standard of PCAF, how to sum up the emissions and how to report on scope 3 of companies. And there is also a proposal to phase in the scope 3. The AU TAG has this proposal to phase in scope 3 emissions starting from high emitting sectors and over the period of 4 years add all sectors in. And PCAF has adopted the same proposal for listed equity and bonds and business loans. So financial institutions, the 75 financial institutions, which include Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, Citi, they will report on these type of metrics going forward. Yeah, that's mainly on the, you could say, on the alignment part and on comparing funds. On the risk part, you see that many have been using the value at risk metric, which indeed is a set of matrices. And what I would like to propose is also to add the value at opportunity here, adding to Leon's comment, because I have not seen a lot done on the value at opportunity, which is, the opportunity is really huge. And most of the risk models I've seen, utilities get a really high value at risk. But if you assess the value at opportunity, that is even bigger. So I would also argue that there should be over time a value at opportunity, as well as a new metric to balance the value at risk.
We do have a question about when your toolkit will be available based on your standard.
The standard is out for public consultation. You can download that from the website, carbonaccountingfinancials.com. And we have a database created by the financial institutions themselves. That's an open source database that will launch. It is now a beta version, but there is a database to get financial institutions started on measuring finance emissions. And there's now 3 million emission factors in the database just to get started.
And so question now, final question for you, David, is do you think there is value in using alternative data, examples like satellite imagery or AI-driven sentiment analysis to help with the overall challenges around data we've been talking about?
Oh, yes, definitely. I think there are multiple challenges and opportunities here. I think to Mary Catherine's point on data and current data, corporate reporting is great for measuring and creating a blunt instrument for a rating on a company. However, there are nuances and opportunities to use location data of facilities, flood, heat index, things like that to identify and measure exposure and the overall risk that a company has. And that's part of the fundamental analysis is we're building in our insight. And it's another facet to look at because a single number does not define a company. I think the other opportunity here is as we're thinking about different instrument types, when we're moving into, and as we're looking at, CMOs or municipals, sovereigns, all of those pieces, we do need different sets of data than normal corporate reporting. I mean, it just doesn't fit. And our opportunity here is, starting with, in some areas, knowing where the mortgages are, understanding the underlying risks of that instrument, so that we can look at that and evaluate that from that angle or that perspective as well. So I think that that's really important. Also, on top of this is, as AI is evolving in natural language processing, being able to search and delve through unstructured data is really an important opportunity here. It allows us to get more near time. As you think about corporate reporting, as I always think about it, by the time a number is published, it's almost a year old and outdated. You can build on trends from that, and understand where a company was and where it was at about 6 months ago in a point in time. However, our opportunity with some of the unstructured data is to give a more near-time understanding of what actions the company is doing, where it's stumbling, or where it's having a problem, or where it's doing really well. I think then that's an opportunity, as we're looking at those data sets and input for the conversation with a company, because it gives us the hot zones of where to engage, where to dig, or where to give them credit on things. I think Gil's idea of, our conversation has truly been value at risk. And I wrote down opportunity right now, because I think it is an important point. We talk about it, but we don't, the measure isn't there. I think, as we've been talking about munis, munis is the perfect opportunity point. They're for a public good, typically. And to understand that and give that weight or credence in our evaluation is an important part.
Great, thanks, Dave. Okay, so final question for everyone, sort of like a thought exercise wish list, right? So besides sort of the traditional carbon metrics, what types of data do you want to see start to be systematically captured? And please feel free to comment on emerging data challenges. For instance, how do we enable companies to report on their biodiversity impact with any degree of accuracy? This is something Sonia mentioned earlier. So yeah, just kind of open thoughts about, where do we go from here, and what additional things you'd like to see. So I'll start with you, Mary Catherine.
Sure. I think in the category of, if we sort of take the existing framework of ESG, as problematic as we've all discussed it is, I think in environmental, we'd love to see more unstructured data sets released from companies. We'd love to see, recognizing that they're relevant in some sectors rather than others, in part to help understand biodiversity, as you suggested. In the case of sort of social metrics, we'd love to see more granular information about gender diversity, about stakeholder management, about labor relations in particular. And in the case of, and then generally, I would just say that I think the frequency of reporting also is a really critical thing. I think that point about the delay, that information that becomes, a year old is important. And so I think really most important is changing our framework for how we have this data shared and disclosed.
Look, if I go back to the beginning of the year, and we all remember Davos and how it was all about sustainability and nothing else, and then two really big things have happened. I mean, probably more than that, but I'll take two really big things. One of which is, of course, the coronavirus, and another of which is the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think that those two things have put a certain amount of focus on the S of ESG, which perhaps didn't quite exist before. And so we're certainly getting a lot of requests to improve the sort of race and ethnicity data within diversity inclusion. We've captured a lot of gender data over the years, but race and ethnicity we have less of. And of course, that's a challenge for companies to report on too, because individuals don't always have to report that information to their companies. So, there are no small challenges in collecting data in this space, but I think that will become more and more pertinent. And look, I'll sort of steal a line from Sarah Breeden, who's at Bank of England and was under Mark Carney when he was there, and she said, a lot of these risks that we're talking about, particularly climate, but not limited to climate, are risks which cannot be diversified away from or divested from. And hence why, the need to collect this data in a more and more robust way. And if COVID has demonstrated anything to us, you cannot divest away from the economic impact of massive humanitarian crises. And so being able to identify what might be coming, being able to identify those kind of social issues that might be very, very significant to the economy, allows you to internalize those externalities and factor them into the investment process. So, more and more on the S side is what we're seeing in terms of demand, in addition to, of course, the massive focus on climate and the environmental space at the beginning of the year.
I think I agree with speakers before. So I think the S is really important. COVID was clear that there are many companies that perform poor on the S. So we need transparency on the S, on the social component. And next to climate, I think biodiversity is the top one on environment. And there's also already this emerging initiative in Europe from financial institutions that look at harmonizing, like PCAF, biodiversity metrics, how to measure that, how to standardize that. So yeah, looking forward to see that evolve.
I have to agree. S has become more and more important, and the pandemic has only crystallized a gray area for our investors that, what it really means. It was very esoteric in our conversations probably a year and a half ago. But now, as we've seen the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, social justice, those areas have become more and more important, and how companies are either contributing to the problem or they're helping with solutions. And it's looking across E, S, and G that corporate actions are, intertwined with, social justice and things like that. You're talking about air quality, so E types of issues, and how we map that to maybe, are they contributing to, less advantaged geographic populations or demographic populations in a certain geography, things like that we're starting to look at and knit together a viewpoint of some of these S issues and drawing from the E, S, and G. So I think as we're starting to frame that conversation, if a company is truly addressing some of those S impacts, I think it's more than just headcount in your employee diversity. I think it's truly important, and we've been pushing companies to report on their diversity, and we encourage that because it's an important input, but it's definitely beyond just the headcount and how they address it. The other E thing that I would be looking for is truly around biodiversity and deforestation, are two issues that are fairly opaque right now, especially when we're looking at supply chain and how you're managing your underlying supply chain. That's those are important issues that we're trying to peel back in our conversation.
Thank you. So we are up on time, and I just want to say it's been such a phenomenal opportunity to hear from the leaders in the space, to hear all the amazing work that your firms are doing. It is a very exciting time to be working in the ESG space. I know that there are a lot of challenges and headaches that we're sort of dealing with on a day-to-day basis as an industry. But all of you have offered extremely important and very, very provocative insights today. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Sonia to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jen. It only falls then to me to thank all the participants for joining us, our splendid panelists in all three panels, and to Patricia Hudson and Jen Bender for their capable work here, and to State Street for all of their help and support on putting this workshop together. We will look forward to seeing you at the next workshop, and this will be up on our website, the recording. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.